Well, hello, my friends. It's John O'Leary, and welcome to the Live Inspired podcast. As you may have heard, we have started a new segment called Monday Moments. The idea behind the Monday Moments is this: for me to share with you, our listeners, a burst of inspiration to start your week on fire, baby, on fire. Each week, we will be a little bit different than the one that preceded it. I may share a story from a Live Inspired community member. I may answer one of your questions, so send them in, or I may share an update from a previous guest. To have our Monday Moment episodes automatically sent to you, subscribe to the Live Inspired podcast on Apple Podcasts or anywhere that you may be listening to your podcast.
Welcome to the Live Inspired podcast with John O'Leary. John is the #1 national best-selling author of the book On Fire. He's a world-class inspirational speaker, and he's the host of the Live Inspired podcast. John interviews extraordinary individuals on their life story so that you can wake up from accidental living and more fully live your life story. Here's your host, John O'Leary.
Well, hello, my friends. This is John O'Leary, and I'm so thrilled to have you joining us in the Live Inspired movement. On every Live Inspired podcast, we have amazing guests who share their story, their challenges, their successes, what they learned, and ultimately what it means for all of us. Well, today we have an awesome guest. As you know, many times when I meet you on the streets or in the back of rooms after speaking, if you are a podcast listener, I ask you 3 questions. Question number 1, why do you listen? And I don't mean like, is there really nothing better to listen to? That's not it at all. I really want to know what it is, what the heart of the show is that turns you on, that has you engage, that motivates you to tune in and to take action. So question 1 is, why do you listen? Secondly, who have been some of your favorite guests? I always love hearing who they are and what it was about them that motivated you and moved you. And then the third question is, who should we have on next? And one of my old friends from growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, she lives in the upper Massachusetts area these days. Her name is Mary Bowler. She sent me an article about a guy named Father Tom Hoar. Father's story is remarkable. It's a story of addictions and mistakes and overcoming and redemption and what he's doing with it today for the rest of us. Before he went live, he shared that, hey, John, we all live in quiet desperation. And I have a message of healing and a message of hope that I look forward to sharing. Well, it is that message today that you will be receiving. A message, whether you are in quiet desperation or you are on fire with life, whether you have an addiction or you've already moved through one, a message that will remind you that in spite of today's challenges, the best are yet to come. So before we bring Father Tom on, I invite you right now to open wide your heart, open wide your mind, buckle up, open your journal, grab a pen, get ready to take notes because this one's going to be great. His name is Father Tom Hoar, and he is our guest today. Father Tom, welcome to Live Inspired with John O'Leary.
Thanks, John. I'm happy to be with you for a little bit.
Well, it's our great pleasure. And Father Tom, for those not named Mary Bowler, who may not yet know your story, they may not yet know what you do professionally, give us a glimpse into what you do today.
I tell people most of the time that I'm the guy that walks the dog in the morning. We have a Bouvier de Flanders named Grace that we're training as a therapy puppy for our resident community of young men in early recovery. I live on an 11-acre island in Mystic, Connecticut that is the home of St. Edmund's Retreat, the Catholic retreat ministry. About 17,000 people come to our island each year. But since 1967, it's been a place where people struggling with addiction and desperation have come to find that moment of healing and hope. We've been hosting 12-step meetings here on the island since 1967, and weekend retreats for people in recovery. And it was about 2004 that a young man that I had known his family for a good long time was struggling through his first semester of college and missed his exams. And his mother said, "Oh, Michael was so upset. He missed his exams because he was up all night, studying." And now I've known this kid since he was, 8 or 9 years old. And I kind of knew what he was up to. And so I said, "Why don't you have him stop by?" And he came in, when he walked in the door, I said to him, Michael, have you had enough?
Yes.
Are you open to changing your life? And he sat down and he started crying, and we had a long talk. And that night, I took him to his first AA meeting. And then he went home and tried to go to meetings and tried to stay sober and tried to go to school, and it just wasn't working. So I said to him, I said to his folks, why don't you have Michael stay here at the retreat center? And we have a lot of AA here. He can work in maintenance. We can help him kind of find that path. Well, he did, and he stayed with us 3 years, and that was in 2004. And I can tell you, he's sober, he's healthy, and he's living a really healthy, balanced life at this point. But just after he came, a buddy of mine from college called me and said, I don't know what to do with John. He's drunk every day. And I said, do you think you can get him to come? And all of a sudden I had 6 guys, all in their early 20s, all who had either failed to launch or flunked out of college, and they were struggling with early addiction. And we ended up starting a program, and now we have 12 guys at a time, no more than 12. They come and they stay with us here at the retreat center. They become part of the community. We help them get into school or back to school. We get them to find that balance, that centeredness that so many people are missing in their lives today. And I tell you, I told them I never had any gray hair until they started coming.
But there's so much there that I'm looking forward on this show to unpacking. A couple things I want to call out on the very front side. First is you don't need to be an alcoholic or know one well to listen on to the rest of the show. I think what Father and I are going to be talking about during our time together is so perfect for all of us. And it's about stories and struggles and redemption and healing. And I just want to make sure that all of our listeners, regardless of what we're dealing with or moving toward, recognizes this show today is for you. That's first. Secondly, and Father, you brought it up already, that question that you asked young Mike, and I think you ask a whole lot of the guys you serve, and it's a question I'm going to invite our listeners to ask themselves right now. Have you had enough? It could be putting up with the crud in your life or a relationship that's toxic or whatever else it may be. But that's a turning point type question that we got to be willing to ask ourselves, or have someone who loves us ask us, have you had enough? It's a great question. And then thirdly, I don't know if you've heard yet, but his name is Father Tom Hoar, which means he's a Catholic priest. And this message will center in part about his life, his experiences, but it's even beyond his own faith walk. And so I just want to make sure that we all buckle up for the ride, because this is a story that Tom Hoar is going to share that will impact you wherever you are on your journey. Would you agree with all that, Father?
Yes, I would. Absolutely. And as I mentioned before we went on the air, one of the stories that I think has a great message is the story of Jean Valjean, Les Miserables.
Here's the guy I may start singing here pretty soon, so you better hurry up and make a point.
Well, here's a guy that, he's been in jail for 19 years. He's been brutalized. He gets paroled. He thinks he's free. And he says, I can breathe the fresh air again. I can drink clean water. And he goes out into the world, and the brutalization continues because society doesn't accept him. They've labeled him. They think they know the inner person. And he becomes dejected, and while he's sleeping in a doorway, a man comes up to him and says, "Come inside, for you are weary. There is wine here to refresh you, and food to make you strong." And he brings him in and he sits him at the table, and he treats him as an honored guest.
Yes,
and I think we live in a society where too many people label people and write them off without knowing who they are, and they don't have any sense that there is inside a precious gift. We judge them by their actions rather than, as Martin Luther King, he said, to be known for the content of your character. And I think a lot of times we write people off because we never allow them to open their inner being to us.
Well, we are looking forward to opening up our inner beings together. And, Jean Valjean was identified as a number. And eventually he tore up that number, that thing that had come to represent his life, 24601.
And we got a 24601.
And said, forget that. That's not going to define me any longer. I'm sacred. I'm worthy. And the best of my days remain in front of me and in front of us. So, Father, before we start talking about the work you do today and the impact of it and what it means for the rest of us, I believe you grew up in a pretty cool neighborhood in South Boston. Is that accurate?
Well, I grew up in Quincy. My family was from South Boston, and we had all the family celebrations back there in South Boston. But, after World War II with the GI Bill, and my dad was in the war, they came back and they were able to have their own homes. And you saw the migration of folks out of the inner city into the suburbs. And I grew up in a neighborhood where 95% of the people in the neighborhood, their dads had come back from the war. And the neighborhood, I'm a baby boomer. The neighborhood was filled with kids. And so it was a great place to grow up. We're certainly influenced by all that. But there are great struggles, when you think in your own head that you don't, measure up to everybody else.
You are one of 5 kids. I think you're the 4th born.
Fourth, yeah.
So I'm one of 6, and I'm the 4th of 6. And it was crazy constantly in our house growing up. I'm assuming that's kind of your experience as a little one. Yes.
A lot of activity, and not only with the 5 of us, but cousins and neighbors, and our lives centered around the neighborhood and the parish. All our activities took place there, and there was that sense that if one of the parents in the neighborhood corrected you, we listened to them. It wasn't, a parent saying, "Who are you to talk to my child that way?" There was that sense of community that many people are missing today.
I think you're right.
We've lost that. And I think, when you talk to people who are struggling with addiction or other mental challenges, they'll say, "I feel like I'm alone in a room of 100 people," because they don't connect.
So tell me why you think it is that almost half, in a recent study by Cigna, half of the nation, U.S., feel isolated or feel lonely. We're connected with phones. We're around people all the time. So why is it that half of us feel like in a room of 100, we're by ourselves?
Because we don't have a real healthy sense of self. And, we've filled our lives with noise, and we've filled our lives with stuff. But it's not the noise and the stuff that gives us meaning. Yeah, I'm a Catholic priest, but I'm also a student of the society we live in. And we've taken God out of our society. We've taken a sense of the sacred out of our society. And we've caused people not to have that inner self-awareness and contentment. People tell me all the time, "Well, I just want to be happy." And I tell them, "No, you don't. You don't want to be happy, because happiness is external." I said, what you really want is you want contentment, that inner joy, that inner peace that allows us to deal with whatever is happening around us without losing our sense of self. Because all of us have to deal with stuff.
Right.
There's lots of us deal with tragedy and pain, and we've bought into this notion that we're victims. I don't think we're victims. I think we've lost the sense of who we are as, and I would say, children of the King, but of that sense that there's a human dignity to us that no one and nothing can rob from us once we really get a real understanding and a hold of it. Most of the time, what I tell people is go read the first chapter of the first book of the Hebrew Scriptures, the book of Genesis, and read what happened on the 6th day. Because it's a beautiful story of creation. And on the 6th day, God says, "Let us make man in our own image after our like." And he did. And then he looked upon it and said, "That is very good. This is very good. The rest of creation was good, but this is very good." And so we're created in the image and likeness of God, and there's a dignity and sanctity to us that allows us to live with that inner sense of peace and joy. But too often we lose that sense, or we've never been helped to nurture that sense.
Mm-hmm.
That's why in football stadiums you see people running around with signs that say John 3:16. That God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten son not to judge the world, but that the world might be saved through him. And coming to develop that connectedness with our Creator, whether we call him Yahweh or God the Father or Allah or however we address the Creator, we have to recognize that it's out of love that we have been created and we have been restored and redeemed by the healing and redeeming sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Other people experience that in different ways. We've had people in our recovery community here who are Hindu, Buddhist, Baptist, Jews, atheists, and devout Catholic families. But I would suspect that it's easy to say that most of them have come here as functioning agnostics.
Mm-hmm.
They've never really come to know God. People say I want to be spiritual, but I don't want to be involved with religion. I said, well, how can you do that? People in recovery go to AA meetings, NA meetings. They go to a fellowship of people who are struggling with the same issues they're struggling with. And the 11th step of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, or the 12 steps, is to increase our conscious contact with God through prayer and meditation. And I said, well, I want to be spiritual, but I don't want to be involved in religion. I said, well, on Saturdays, Friday nights, Saturdays, Sundays, there are people who gather to pray.
Mm-hmm.
I said, hanging around with them is a good thing because you might hear something that would help.
People listening to you right now might be sitting back on their way to work or while they're working out or just kind of hanging out at home thinking, man, this guy's got it all figured out and I don't. So I'm going to read our listeners a quote from you just so they recognize that Tom is on the journey like everybody else. So this one from you, Father Tom. I never felt good enough. I never felt smart enough. My brother was always the better athlete. Even though I excelled in school internally, I never felt good enough. And you see that in many alcoholics and in many addicts. I could preach a great sermon on how much God loved you, but I wasn't always sure that he loved me. Even though I achieved, I love this line, I lived in fear. You wrote those words.
I did.
Unpack it for me.
Well, people in recovery, and I can identify with this, say that there's a hole in them. They feel a hole, and they look to fill that hole up with all sorts of stuff, and it doesn't do it. And so they keep searching and searching and searching. I believe the only way to really fill up that hole is with a relationship with God. And I was 10 years a priest before I really came to the true understanding of what that means, because I kept looking at everybody else thinking they got it. How come I can't get it? And then finally, when I was able to say, I've had enough, I'm ready to let go. I'm ready to let go and let God into my life in a real and intimate way.
So I'm gonna take you back there for a moment. I believe it was October of '89. You're at St. Michael's College in Vermont. You're in charge of campus ministry. You're doing the thing. And part of the way you're filling the hole back then is with alcohol. So this story isn't just about you fixing others. It's a story you lived yourself. And you get a call late night that a fire breaks out and you are the chaplain of the fire department. So when the call goes out, you go out with it. What happens from there?
Well, I went up to the fire scene and, I know the fire chief. I know the dean of students, and it was on the North Campus. And they said, "You been drinking?" I said, No. And I realized, because no one ever saw me drunk. I drank alone at night, when nobody else was around, because I was very much aware that I didn't want to scandalize anybody. But that night I had been drinking, and I got in my car and I drove back the mile to my residence, and I passed all these police cars and fire trucks, and I was very conscious of the fact that I got to drive down this road and not let anybody know that I'm drunk. And I got back to my room and I looked in the mirror and I said, "What the hell are you doing?" And that was my last drink. But I stopped drinking, but I still felt miserable inside. I always tell people God writes straight with crooked lines. He sent me a seminarian as an intern, and one Friday afternoon he came into the office and he said, I'm celebrating my first anniversary in recovery, and they've asked me to speak at the big meeting downtown. And I got sober in New Orleans at the seminary, and there's no one here. And I said, I'll go with you. I'll go with you. And I went, and I walked in the room, and I knew half the people in the room, doctors, housewives, plumbers, and they were all saying, oh, it's Father Thomas, so good to see you. And I said, well, I'm here for Jeff. I'm here for Jeff. So I sat there and I listened, and I thought, what do these people have? I want it. The next day, he said to me, what do you think? So I was very proud of you. Oh, you've done so well. He said to me, you can go for yourself if you want. And I said, I can? He said, yeah. The next night I went to another meeting, and I've been going ever since.
What do you find at those meetings that you weren't finding in your dorm room? What is it about the meetings, bringing people together? And I have a whole bunch of friends who hit up those meetings that brings you such peace and that brings you back again and again and again.
Most people don't understand alcoholics and addicts. But when you're living it, there's a sense of authenticity and a genuineness that is absolutely refreshing, because finally you find a group of people that absolutely understand what you've experienced. When they share their story, they share the story of experience, strength, and hope. They're willing to share their journey of recovery and hope that eluded me for years and years and years. When I went, I had a PhD and 3 master's degrees. So it wasn't a sense that I wasn't smart enough. It's that I didn't feel good enough.
So I'm curious, a bunch of my friends who do attend meetings, one of them said to me recently, John, it's the only place I can still go where I can rip off my mask and be myself.
Absolutely.
I understand how we can rip off our mask in that meeting, but I'm curious, Father, why can't we do it in every meeting and in every situation? What do you think it is about the way we lead and live our lives that keeps us wearing that mask, plastering on the makeup and trying to portray an image that really isn't authentically who we are?
I suspect that most alcoholics and addicts live in fear, that fear of not being good enough. Addiction has physical, emotional, and spiritual components to it. When you are in those meetings, people are authentic, and you don't have to worry about being judged. You don't have to be perfect. People are not going to use what you share against you. Now, I've been going for 29 years, and I'm a little bit more comfortable even talking about this publicly.
I mean, you realize this was a podcast that you're on right now. It's not just you and me in an AA meeting. Oh, just want to make sure.
Yeah, I do. But that's why it's called Alcoholics Anonymous.
Right.
Because there's such a stigma, and anonymity is an important part of the traditions of the 12-step community. And today, people go and try to dig up dirt on what you did in high school and discount everything that has happened to you since. And they want to beat you with that. Today, in the Catholic community, we celebrate the conversion of St. Paul. Now, here's a guy who is, as the Acts of the Apostles describe him, breathing fire. He's been given authority to go out and find anybody who follows the way, that follows Christ, and bring them back to Jerusalem in chains. God uses him, and he becomes the great apostle to the Gentiles, to the world, bringing the message of hope. We don't accept conversion. And Jean Valjean, the fellow Javert, the policeman, is chasing him through the years. And at the end, Javert gives in to his own despair because he can't accept the fact that Jean Valjean has become a different man. I think we have to allow people to grow and develop and to learn and to accept them for who they are today, not what they were like 20 or 30 years ago. We live in a society where we're looking for that gotcha, I gotcha. But when I first got sober, a fellow that had gone to school with me, he says, I remember you sitting in the dorm drinking Manhattans and bumming cigarettes. I remember what you were like. And I said, yeah, I did that. But that's not who I am now. And a lot of people are afraid that people are going to judge them for their past rather than allow the grace of God to help change them and allow other people to see them differently, who they are.
On Ender's Island, how many folks, how many leaders, how many lives have you directly impacted through the work that you do there?
Families will come to me and ask me to help do an intervention and get their father, their mother, their brother into rehab and recovery. I do spiritual direction with people who have lost a child. Tomorrow I'm going to bury a fellow who died of an overdose. His parents came to me trying to find a way to help their son, and as much as they tried, they couldn't physically save him. And tomorrow I'll do his funeral and bury him. Each day I get up, I never know what's going to happen. But each day I get up, trusting God's grace will work through me. Whenever I preach, I always say to the people, I've heard it said, and I truly believe, and I do, I truly believe that there can be no power in the preacher unless there's prayer in the pews. Because I truly believe that the Holy Spirit works through us as a community and enriches and empowers each of us to use our gifts and talents for the benefit of all. I trust God's grace. John, I have to tell you, there are days I still feel I'm not smart enough, I'm not good enough. But God's grace is sufficient, as St. Paul says. It's sufficient, and that's what I depend upon.
Well, it is enough. And you asked a question, you ask it of others. I'm going to have you help us understand the power of it. Have you had enough? Where's the power in that question?
Are you ready to really let go of the way you've been living, the way you've been thinking, and really allow God's grace to bring you down a new path of healing and hope? People don't like change. Even in our misery, we're afraid, if I let go of the drug, if I let go of the booze, if I let go of this or that, what am I going to be? It's a courageous moment when somebody says, yeah, I've had enough, I'm willing. And it really is about willing.
Can you do this by yourself? Can willpower carry the day?
No. I mean, one of the very first steps of the 12 steps is that I'm powerless. And when alcohol or sex or drugs or whatever is in my life is unmanageable. Well, last night I was invited to speak to a group of seminarians from around New England. And I took one of our guys who's been in recovery for 2 years, and he told them his story. And he told them the neighborhood that he grew up in and the home he grew up in and the things he did. And he's sitting there well-dressed, very articulate. And he said, I'm a heroin addict. This is what a heroin addict looks like. And you could see all these young guys kind of looking like, oh, yeah. People still stereotype. The person in the next office, the woman standing in line ahead of you at the grocery store, the student sitting behind you in a classroom, the person waiting on you at a restaurant. Any one of them could be an alcoholic or an addict. The question is, are they in recovery? I just recently saw a statistic that said 29% of the population of America are struggling with some type of addiction. And addiction is not just alcohol and drugs. It's pornography, it's process, it's video games and gaming and gambling and food, anything that takes
success
over,
and fame and follows and everything else.
Yeah, that takes over your life, and you can't imagine your life without it. And yet you desperately want to let it go, but you can't.
So for those of us fathers, as we get ready to shift gears a little bit into what we call the Live Inspired 7, for those of us who feel as if they haven't been asked lately, have you had enough? But they're being asked right now by you, and they don't know what to do with it. They don't know what to do in that relationship or that struggle or that addiction or whatever else is kind of tying them down and keeping them feeling as if they're not enough. What do you think their next step is?
Finding someone to help that can give them some guidance. Might be a rabbi, a pastor, a priest. It might be a social worker. It might be the guy that lives down the hall in your apartment building, or the woman who's in the next office who you've heard are in recovery. You might ask them because they might have some insight, but not to allow the fear of change prevent you from taking that step.
And then, Tom, I think it's going to be a similar answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What if you know someone, a spouse, a partner, a family member, the lady 2 offices away that you feel is struggling mightily and is in need of a friend and the next step and someone who loves them enough to say, hey, have you had enough? What would you say for those of us who know folks like that and don't know what to do about it?
Well, that's a toughie because we're afraid that we're going to hurt their feelings or make them angry. But becoming angry is a great defense. But as I said to the seminarians last night, if you know somebody that's struggling, you can't not act. You have to act. and you may not know exactly what to do, but you can't let someone, if somebody was bleeding to death in the next office, would you walk by and say, hey, enjoy, have a good lunch and go off? No, you do something. You might not be a well-trained medical technician, but you try something. When an addict or an alcoholic realizes that the gig is up, that's when they begin to say, well, maybe I got to do something different. John, it's not easy.
No, but it sounds like life isn't, but it begins by having enough faith to take the next step and to trust that the ground will appear in front of you.
Yeah, the courage to stand up and to speak the truth and to witness the absolute love that God has for each of us in all of us.
Final question, just because I would imagine it's on many of our listeners' hearts right now, is I have no relationship at all with God and no interest in that thing. You know, not everybody not everybody is on fire in their faith or has a personal relationship. For those of us struggling in that area, or we don't even feel like we're struggling, we just don't have time or interest in it, Father, what would you say to those who have that perspective?
Do you have contentment? Do you have that inner joy? And I would suspect that most of them would say no, not really. If they're truly honest with themselves, all it takes is you don't know what to do, you don't know what to say. Show up on Sunday morning and sit in the back of the church and just listen. Or if you know somebody who is a member of Temple and they go every Friday or Saturday morning to Temple, say, can I come along? You know what I say to people, when you have people that are struggling, and they're alienated from God, from church, say, hey, listen, do you want to go out to supper on Saturday night? Sure. Yeah. He said, well, I'll pick you up at 4:00. We'll stop at St. Mary's. We'll go to Mass and then we'll go out to dinner. And they say, huh? Yeah, try it. It might work. You don't know. Sometimes you got to be not only courageous, but you got to think outside the box. And I tell everybody at Easter and Christmas, they come to church every Sunday, and they're all moaning and groaning, all the Christmas and Easter Catholics that come. And I said, listen, sit in the back of the church, stand in the back of the church, let them have the good seats up front, because maybe, just maybe, they might hear something or experience something, and they'll come back next week.
Well, Father, we appreciate you inviting us to come back next week and to boldly ask the question, have you had enough? And to begin the journey forward. It's for me, so inspirational to recognize, first of all, we're not alone. And secondly, there are a whole lot of other people out there willing to walk with us forward to possibility and toward recovery. And thank you for being one of them. And every one of our guests that we've had on the Live Inspired podcast has been asked 7 questions as we wrap up. And the first question they have answered is, what is the best book you have ever read? So, Father Tom Hoar, what is the best book you've ever read?
I would say the Gospel of Matthew.
What is it about the Gospel of Matthew that you found so motivating and moving?
Well, especially with the Sermon on the Mount, it challenges us not to live minimally, but to really strive for the life of virtue.
What's one positive characteristic, one trait that you possessed as a little child in South Boston that you wish you exhibited as brilliantly and as brightly today?
Curiosity.
Father, if your home caught fire and all living things, pets, animals, friends, colleagues, neighbors, everybody's out, and you have an opportunity to run back in and save one item, what one item would you run in and grab?
I wouldn't grab anything.
Let it burn?
Yeah, because it's just stuff.
Is there, if I forced you to say, hey, you got to run in and get one thing, or we all burn, what is the one item that you actually would feel important enough to grab?
A pair of rosary beads that my Aunt Helen gave me on the day of my ordination.
All right.
It represents not only a relationship with God through prayer, but it also kind of is a family thing.
I hear you. If you could sit on a bench overlooking a beach and have a long conversation with anyone living or dead, who would you want to be seated next to on that bench?
Oh, Jesus, of course.
What's the first question you ask?
Didn't your dad do a great job with this view? I live on an island, and I look out right now. I'm looking out on a sky that is just absolutely aflame with color. And every time I see it, I just think of the creative genius of God.
Right on. I think one of the mistakes we make is to miss what is right in front of us. Sometimes family, sometimes nature, and some of the people who live closest to the ocean or the mountains don't even acknowledge how incredible their backyard is.
Yeah, I agree.
What is the best advice you've ever received?
Don't drink and go to meetings.
What would you tell your 20-year-old self?
What would I tell my 20-year-old self? There's nothing to be afraid of.
Father Tom Hoar, there is nothing to be afraid of, and it has been said that all great people and healers and leaders can have their lives summed up in one sentence. How would you like your one sentence to read?
He saw people in pain and tried to bring them a message of healing and hope.
Well, Father Tom Hoar, the message of healing and hope has been brought forward mightily by you, both on this podcast and also in your day job. I want to thank you for spending some of your day with us. I want to thank Mary Bowler, one of our faithful listeners of the Live Inspired podcast, for connecting the dots. And I'm going to let you get the final word in. Father, when people get back to their day job after listening to this podcast, what's one thing you hope they heard loud and clear?
That there is a world of opportunity, and God's grace will allow us, if we surrender to it, to discover a life that is second to none.
Well, let's move forward into that life that is second to none. My friends, that is Tom Hoar. My name is John O'Leary, and today is your day. Live a life that is second to none, and live a life that is truly inspired. So, my friends, I want to thank you for being part of our Live Inspired community. If you have questions, if you have feedback, if you have suggestions, we want to hear from you. Come on. Email me at info@johnolearyinspires.com. You can send your questions there. You can send your feedback or guests you want to have on the Live Inspired couch. info@johnolearyinspires.com. I want to thank all of you for being listeners. I want to thank you all for being active, engaged members. And I want to remind you that the best of your journey remains in front of you. So for this time, and until next time, this is your day. Live inspired.